For 17 years, she sat as Chief Justice of Canada, the first woman and the longest-serving Chief Justice in the country. During her term, Beverley McLachlin held steadfast to her self-described judicial philosophy. Judges are to be scrupulously nonpartisan and impartial. She's on record as saying, "The courts are the ultimate guardians of the rights of society in our system of government, and that the court belongs to the people of Canada, and it should reflect them." Thank you for joining us today for this conversation. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
You know, your career has been so remarkable in so many ways and various stages, but most impactful was your 28 years on the Supreme Court. Do you remember when you first got the call saying, would you like to do this?
I do. I was taking a much needed vacation with my then 12-year-old son, and I got a call from the Prime Minister's office saying, you might be asked, and if you're offered, would you take it? So I thought about it. I'd been recently widowed. My son would have to move from his schools. It was not necessarily something I was going to do. It would be a lot of upheaval for our family. And anyway, he came to me in the morning, and I discussed it with him. And he
was
only
your son?
12, yeah, only 11. But he came in the morning. He said, "Mom, you've got to do this." And the next evening, about 3 o'clock Australia time, I got a call from the Prime Minister, and it was later than had been told. And I ended up pitch dark, dropping the phone, and of course it was the operator on the end of the line. And she said, "What's going on there?" And I said, "It's all right. Can you talk?" "Yes, I can." So Prime Minister Mulroney said, "Goodness me, I have to go all the way to Australia to find you on a boat. Don't you judges ever work?" But he asked me to do the job, and I said yes at that point.
And was it all you expected it to be?
Oh, that and more. It was just a lot more work than I ever anticipated. It was. That was the early days. The charter came in 82, and I came to the court in 89. So the charter had only been in force for 7 years, and it takes a while for cases to work their way. So the court, before I got there, had worked their way through a tranche of important cases, but there was still a lot more to go in the charter interpretation. And the court went from being a very small, rather sleepy affair to being a court that was at the center of the debates people were having about rights and freedoms and all of these issues raised by the charter, to see what laws would stand and what laws wouldn't stand.
So at this point, are you allowed to have an opinion about the charter?
Oh yes, well, I think we all do. I'm on record as a huge booster of the charter. I think it has served our country very well. We're now 40 years on, but it has put us at the forefront of rights jurisprudence throughout the world, and I think it's really brought a lot of benefits to citizens, particularly people who were not in a majoritarian or powerful position before the charter. So we have a lot wider anti-discriminatory rights. We have women, gay people, others who may have been disadvantaged have really seen their position shored up by this. And an important aspect is the Indigenous file, because until around 87, there really wasn't much jurisprudence on Indigenous rights. And in fact, a lot of people didn't think there were any. And the Supreme Court started pronouncing on the cases that Indigenous groups brought. And of course, that has set up the whole legal framework for land claims, for usage claims, for governance and relationships between government and First Nations.
You have actually said that the biggest challenge or project for your legal cohort is to try and ensure the peaceful evolution of Indigenous rights.
Yeah.
Now, are you happy with the way it's evolving?
Yes, generally I am. So now there are other cases building on that jurisprudence.
I attended a speech that the former Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, gave to BC leaders and chiefs, and she just flat out said, it's been decided. Rights are guaranteed.
That's right.
And the courts have decided it. Let's move on. The conversation's not anymore about whether or not you have rights.
Oh, she's absolutely right. But people don't always want to accept those changes.
Decisions like that surprise some people.
Oh, yes.
And there, of course, was some controversy.
Oh, a lot of controversy, and I recognize that.
And how did you handle it? Did people come at you and try to get you to change your mind or express anger? What did they do?
No, you know, the court was so respected, and I think is so respected. There would, of course, never be any interference. That would be unthinkable, because the court has to be completely independent. You can't lobby the Supreme Court of Canada. You can send and intervene. You can be an intervener and have your voice heard in the decision-making process if you're not a party but someone affected. But you cannot ever contact a judge directly, and then a decision is made. And yes, I was aware of criticism from certain quarters during the 90s, particularly. There was quite a movement saying that unelected judges are making the law, and that they're making it up, and they called it judicial activism. And I was aware of that. And when I'd give speeches, I'd say, I don't think there is such a thing as judicial activism, because we don't set the agenda. We just answer the questions that the litigants have brought before us. What is the decision on the law?
So our court, in fact, is protected in the way that it's set up and the expectations of the public. So it's almost isolated, which is good for being able to make the decision. But does it mean it's a lonely life sometimes?
It is, yeah. I think any justice of the court would tell you that you feel cut off from friends and colleagues and so on. I mean, it's much less so than it used to be. It's quite acceptable now for judges to go out and give speeches and to socialize to a certain extent with people in other walks of life. You're fairly alone, and you're fairly isolated for the most part, and particularly when it comes to making your decisions. As I say, you have to make them on the basis of the submissions that have been made in the court. And you can't go out and talk to your neighbor and say, well, you know, what do you think about that? You know, it just wouldn't be right.
So there you are doing your job the way you responsibly believe it should be done, somewhat isolated, and you wake up one morning and you read the paper, and there's Prime Minister Harper saying that you've misbehaved.
Yeah, well,
what a shock.
That was a shock. I was in New Brunswick. I had no inkling that was coming. And of course it was very, very serious if his charges had been substantiated, which they were not. I had a decision to make whether I would respond. The tradition is that judges really don't respond to criticism. But it had been established, I think, with that if facts need to be corrected, judges can, in a very limited way, set that out, because the public is entitled to know what happened. So I issued a very brief statement just saying I had done nothing wrong, and these are the facts, and it involved an issue about, the allegation was I tried to interfere with the Prime Minister's prerogative to appoint a certain person. And that would have had to have been done through a phone call or something like that. And so I set out all the contacts I'd had, and I basically said, this is what happened, in very terse language, and I laid it out there. And if the Prime Minister wanted to contradict me, he could, but he didn't.
We talked about isolation a bit. You speak about it very emotionally in your book, growing up, that you felt very isolated. Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood? Yeah,
well, it was mainly rural, and I remember there were a couple of years when we lived in basically what you'd call steam age conditions, but pre-electric conditions. We had a log house, and we got our water from the spring behind, and the cooking was done on a wood stove, and you had kerosene lamps in the evening, and that was it. So I experienced all that, and I think I've been very lucky because I lived through that age, and then everything, rural electricity came, everything changed, and then I lived through the computer age, and now I'm living in the digital age. So it's been quite a ride, but it was isolating being alone on the ranch, and I was just 11, 12. And not being able to have friends, not being able to see other kids, I felt that very hard. So I compensated by reading a lot of books, and I read novels a lot, and learned about the world in that way, and lived in my mind a lot to get around that. Yeah.
And you said you had to struggle to keep the demons away. I
did. There was a time, I guess this happens to young people often, and when I was very, I guess you'd say close to some sort of mental. I really did contemplate suicide, but I never did it. You
actually visually.
Obviously.
You visually thought of how.
Yeah, I did, and I had these. There weren't voices in a schizophrenic sense, but these recurrent thoughts that should happen. And
how would you do it?
I think it was partly fear. And pardon?
How you thought about how you would do it?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, but then you fight that back and you say no, and I did. So, but it was struggle. It was a real struggle. In a way, I'm glad I went through that too, because as a judge, I saw many young people who were having that kind of existential struggle. And I think it comes very often when you leave childhood and you realize you're now going into adulthood. You don't think about it in those terms, and everything seems very frightening. And you feel especially if you feel you're isolated, and you can talk yourself into a bad place, easily. So I've always been able to empathize with young people who try to commit suicide or to have other problems. I think we need to spend a lot of money, more than we do, on mental health for kids.
As a woman, of course, at the time that you went into law, it was not so common as it is today.
No.
What were the challenges you faced as you went through your law career and your early judging as a woman?
Yeah, the first and the biggest was a societal challenge from society, because I was going to law school in the late 60s and starting to practice law late 60s, 70s. And you may remember in 1964, a writer named Betty Friedan published a book called The Feminine Mystique. And it really exposed the issue for women at the time. And Betty Friedan said, women have been told that their fulfillment in life is through marriage and family, with the caveat that they could, for a few years anyway, go into a woman's profession like nursing or teaching or whatever. But your raison d'etre and your being and your aspirations had to be focused on being a wife and a mother. And of course, women, that was a 19th century view. We were now in the middle of the 20th century, and women were still being told after the Second World War that they had to stay home, and they couldn't aspire to being a lawyer or a doctor or whatever. And Ms. Friedan pointed out that was wrong. I mean, women should be able to find self-fulfillment in whatever they want to do, provided it's legal. And if they want to be a lawyer or a doctor, or if they want to fly a plane, or they want to do whatever it is, they should be able to make the choice for themselves. And this was a recognition of a terrible inequality that had prevailed. Anyway, I get into the practice of law, and I was definitely, I started law school same year that book came out, but I was definitely a person who challenged that traditional role. I didn't see myself finding fulfillment in only being, domestic wife, mother. And I wanted to do more with my life. Where that came from, I don't know, but I was definitely in that mode. That book came along, and I and other women who read it said, wow, that's exactly where we are. But the world hadn't changed. So my first articling interview, I was at the top of my class. I thought I'd do fine. And gentleman, after what I thought had been a great interview, said, why do you want to work? And I was just stunned. I didn't understand. And then he said, well, you're married, aren't you? And then I realized that the tradition at that time in that city, Edmonton, was that you, if you were a married woman, I had married the summer before, if you were a married woman, you would not work outside the home.
Doesn't it make you wonder deep inside where that courage came from? Like, was it your mom?
Yeah, I don't know. I've always, I don't know. My mother, maybe in a sense that I reacted against the fact that she, who was a very intelligent woman with great gifts, and she'd always kind of wanted to work outside the home, but it wasn't there for her. And I saw that example, and I think that's what made me say it's wrong that a woman should be defined solely by her marriage.
You've been in the newspaper recently about your appointment in Hong Kong.
Right.
Can you talk to me a bit about that court and why you are comfortable staying on the court at this point?
Well, the court is modeled on the British model, and the judges are totally independent, and the government does not interfere with who sits on what case or anything to do with the process, and evidently not the decision making. And the Chief Justice assures me that that continues to be the case, and I believe it is the case based on what I'm seeing and doing, and there's never been any active interference. The previous Chief Executive Officer gave her undertaking that that would not happen. So I have, obviously things are not good in Hong Kong, and many people disagree with the security law that was passed in 20, I can't remember which. But anyway, it is quite draconian. And so some people say, well, you should resign because you being there is propping up what they view as an illegitimate government. And but I say I don't think I'm propping up an illegitimate government. I know I am not. I have nothing to do with the government. What I am doing is lending support to the last institution that is the last democratic institution that the Hong Kong has.
Looking back over your experience and the various positions you've held within law, even teaching law, where do you think the Canadian system has some weaknesses? Where are we letting some people down?
I think the court system is good and credible and honest, but our big Achilles heel in the justice system is access to justice. Finding ways for not just the wealthy and the corporations to use the courts, but finding ways for ordinary people to find justice.
One of the remarkable things you've been able to do is have a career, be a wife, and a mother. Mm-hmm. And any of us who are in that position, that's not easy.
No.
How did you manage?
Well, it was very difficult, especially when our son was very young, and you have a full-time job, and we availed ourselves of daycare and that kind of thing, but there were strict limits on how much, how that was run. And if you were 5 minutes late due to, a telephone call that took too long or something, you'd get scolded at the daycare, and you realize you just couldn't do that. And so I sometimes felt that I was teaching law at the time, and it was hard sometimes to do all that and do it all well. And I think that's when I say in my book, but that's when I realized that you can't be perfect. I would never be a perfect mother, and I would never be a perfect law teacher, and I'd never be a perfect lawyer or judge. But I would do the best I could do in the circumstances.
You had the responsibility, of course, of being a role model for everybody. Not just for your family, but for everybody. Mm. I'm sure you took it seriously.
Oh yeah, I tried to behave myself, but especially for the role model is very, very important for younger women to be able to see themselves in that position, in that career. I had no role models in the law to speak of, and that it didn't stop me, but I could sense how much easier it would have been had I had those role models.
I saw a photo of you as you walked out for the last time, and the doors shut behind you.
Yeah, that's a great photo, eh? Yeah.
Tears?
Yeah, I was pretty emotional, but the statistics tell us that a lot of people get seriously ill or pass away within a short time of their retirement, and I really do believe it's the loss and the grieving and the lack of, well, it's over, the thinking it's over for me now, those kind of things are with you, and your health suffers if you're not careful.
So in the future, when someone says Beverley McLachlin, what do you hope the first thing they say is?
Well, I hope they say I was a good justice, good judge, and that I was fair and honest and a person possessing integrity and caring about other people.
Thank you, Beverley.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you.
Her conscious objectivity compelled her to judge as an act of imagination, and that meant putting herself in the shoes of different parties and to think about how it looks from their perspective, and really think about it, not just give it lip service. McLachlin was not afraid to use the power of the court to change the law. And in fact, she justified doing so when acting in accordance with the values of society. Beverley McLachlin, a BC legendary lawmaker.